All right, great. I'm Shelley Weezer. I'm the director of the Lifelong Learning Program here at Butler College, and I'd like to just extend a very warm, wet welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. This week kicks off the Lifelong Learning series for fall and for the academic year. So it's great to see familiar faces, special guests. We have a big group from Germany. Welcome, German students, professors, friends, everybody. It's just great to have everyone here and extend this welcome. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the executive director of the St. Augustine Historical Society. Lifelong Learning and the Historical Society have been doing lots of things for at least 3 or 4, many years, but this speaker series has really kind of come to light in the last couple of years. So with that, I'm going to invite Megan Altus to come up and introduce our keynote or guest speaker tonight, Dr. Mike Butler.
Thank you for joining us this evening. If you're not aware, tonight's talk is the first in a series of talks, 5 talks and an exhibit that we are putting up called From Territorial Fights to Civil Rights and Enfranchisement in the Oldest City. So please join us next time when we welcome Dr. Steve Knoll on October 10th. And we'll have 3 more after that, all here at the Markland House. But tonight, our special speaker, Dr. J. Michael Butler, is the Keenan Distinguished Professor of History at Butler College, where he's taught since 2008. His work has appeared in many leading peer-reviewed academic publications, such as American Studies, the Journal of Southern History, Southern Cultures, and most recently, the Journal of African American History. His book, Beyond Integration, The Black Freedom Struggle in Escambia County, Florida, 1960 to 1980, won a 2017 Florida Book Award in nonfiction. Dr. Butler, who received his PhD in history from the University of Mississippi, specializes in Southern cultural history with an emphasis on the Black freedom struggle. Teaches a number of classes on the topics and has spoken to dozens of teachers and community groups about the civil rights movement in African American history. His work has been featured by PBS, NPR, C-SPAN, NBC.com, Salon.com, Vanity Fair magazine, The Dan Le Batard Show, and an Emmy-winning First Post News documentary, among others. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Mike Butler.
Number one, I never thought that I would be the featured speaker at an academic presentation where we had tailgating before. So I am happy to see that many of you, particularly our German contingent, is on their 2nd or even 3rd drink, but I was even so lucky. No, it is an honor to be asked by the Historical Society, Lifelong Learning, and Florida Humanities, who sponsored this series of events, to be the first in a series of talks on local history. So thank you to everyone involved. And we'll do something tonight that's a little different. I was telling one student who asked what the topic tonight would be, if it's something that I've talked about before. And it's, yeah, obviously. I've talked about St. Augustine civil rights many times, but very rarely in St. Augustine. You know, it's an honor to talk about historical topics with people who actually lived the events, because it was not that long ago. Okay. I think, though, one of the things that I have an obligation to do as a professional historian is put these events in context. Why do they matter? We hear that the St. Augustine movement was important. We know that it had national ramifications. We know that our neighbors were involved on both sides. But so, why does it matter? I've never given a talk quite like this publicly before. But the connection of our local history to national legislation is an important story that demonstrates the power of knowing your own history and understanding the consequences of events that continue to shape us today. It's relevant, it's timely, and it's on professional historians to make sure the stories don't die because they're uncomfortable truths. So, St. Augustine and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. To put it in context, we have to go to Birmingham, Alabama. We could go all the way back to the beginning. Whatever that beginning is, right? Anytime that you talk about a topic or anytime you talk about a subject, you have to decide where do you begin and when do you begin the story. For me, the national importance of what happens in St. Augustine is the legislation that comes out of the local movement because it adds the complexities, it adds the nuance, it adds the details that are important for the nation as a whole. So what I wanted to do is go back to Birmingham, or as it was popularly known, Birmingham. It's called Birmingham because it was the most industrialized city in the South. The mining industry was huge. The Black population was incredibly large, almost a 50-50 split demographically. But African Americans only constituted fewer than 15% of registered voters. There was some economic mobility. There was a thriving Black middle class. And for those African Americans, including ministers, labor leaders, and teachers who got out of their so-called place, their homes had a tendency to explode. This is why the Black middle class residential area in Birmingham was nicknamed Dynamite Hill. And as one person who lived in Birmingham during this time told me, the only difference between a Klansman and a police officer was the uniform they were wearing at the time. So, between 1957 and 1963, there were 18 unsolved bombings in Birmingham, Alabama, in one community. The police commissioner was straight out of Central Casting, right? Eugene Bull Connor. Bull Connor. The patron saint of the local KKK was his nickname. And he was someone who was absolutely determined to use his power to keep all Black people subservient to whites in all ways. The individual who becomes the father of the Birmingham movement was a Baptist minister named Fred Shuttlesworth. Now that name's going to come up again later when we get to St. Augustine because Reverend Shuttlesworth comes to St. Augustine. So, Reverend Shuttlesworth fought for integrated schools, integrated public facilities, even the right to vote. He was assaulted many times. His home was actually dynamited while he was under his own roof, while the bomb was under the bed that actually protected him. Shuttlesworth is an interesting guy because he believed, after surviving this dynamite attack, that he had a divinely gifted role to play in the American movement. God saved me from this movement. I have no fear. So, with the movement in Birmingham beginning to pick up, and I don't know why this picture always kind of makes me chuckle, but Klansmen going to church. Birmingham, 1963, right? Shuttlesworth, most importantly, was a member of an organization that was formed in 1957 to replicate the successes of the Montgomery bus boycott. It was founded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Shuttlesworth belonged, all ministers based in the South. It was locally driven. He decided that the thing to do, because local support was beginning to wane in the Black community, was to invite in the national organization, was to ask Dr. King and the big guns, so to speak, to come to Birmingham and help organize the movement. Well, that's exactly what he does. And he reaches out in early 1963. Spring of 1963, Dr. King, SCLC decide they will go to Birmingham. The stakes in Birmingham, before I move on, for SCLC are important, right? SCLC is coming out of the Albany, Georgia campaign. SCLC had experienced quite a few setbacks. The organization was almost broke. Not only that, but you had the rise of Black Muslim groups, Malcolm X, Nation of Islam, Muhammad Ali. The student-led movement was beginning to take off. In other words, Dr. King of 1962 is not the Dr. King we remember today. His organization was in trouble. His biggest victory had been Montgomery, 1955, 1956. He understood that he risked becoming a footnote, and his movement risked becoming a footnote with the greater changes that were taking place in the nation as a whole. So, for local people like Shuttlesworth and the Birmingham citizenry, they needed outside assistance. They needed help. For SCLC, they needed a cause. They needed to fundraise. They needed to be relevant yet again. Birmingham was where it happened. Now, to give you a quick overview of the Birmingham campaign. One of the things that happens in Birmingham that made it unique is that Birmingham was targeted for integration at all levels: schools, employment, public accommodations, even the vote. It was going to be a multifaceted campaign. SCLC had never done anything like it. And they brought traditional tactics to Birmingham, like boycotts, marches, mass meetings in churches. Everything that we consider to be part of the classical movement really came together as a strategy in Birmingham. But one of the things that had not happened was Dr. King had never violated a court order. Never. Didn't do it in Albany, didn't do it in Montgomery. The idea was to let these legal issues play themselves out democratically through the legal process. However, when he gets to Birmingham and Birmingham civic leaders know what's about to transpire in their city, injunction, no public marches, no public demonstration. And for Good Friday of 1963, this was to be the kickoff of the campaign in Birmingham. The threat was that it would be a stillborn movement. There was debate within SCLC about whether or not the march should continue, the Good Friday March, as it was later called. Andrew Young believed that this was the moment where, quote, his true leadership began. Dr. King to the back of the Gadsden hotel room where he was staying. He came out dressed in denim shirts and pants, the uniform of the worker, and said, "We're marching." Violated the order, was arrested for it. The next morning, a letter was published in the Birmingham News signed by 8 white clergy that basically preacher shamed King. We're ministers. You are not acting as a man of faith. You're an outsider. You're an agitator. Unwise and untimely is what they claim this demonstration was. Let white people and local black people work it out on their own. Be patient. Dr. King responded by beginning, he was in solitary confinement, but SCLC members checked on him every hour to make sure he wasn't being beaten, quite frankly. And according to Andrew Young, every hour that someone checked on him, he would smuggle out pieces of what became Letter from Birmingham Jail. Okay? Now, all of this is important because the Letter from Birmingham Jail is the single most important defense of nonviolent self-resistance the movement ever produced. Period. If you want to know what nonviolence is, if you want to know what civil disobedience means in the 20th century segregated South, you have to read Letter from Birmingham Jail. For me, the summary is he defended the movement on a legal basis. This is an American movement. This is constitutional. He defended it on a spiritual level. That we answer when laws are unjust, we are obligated to answer to a higher power. Right? The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Usually the quotes that people know of from Martin Luther King, even when they use it erroneously, come from Letter from Birmingham Jail, right? But the part of the letter I think that is most touching is that he defended nonviolence on a personal basis by explaining what the consequences of segregation and racism were on his own children. As a father, telling his kids they can't go to the fair because it's not a day where Black people could go. That letter made national and international news. The incarceration of Dr. King made national and international news. And it did what, I think, was an unintended consequence of the imprisonment. And that was put SCLC and Dr. King back in the middle of the national civil rights narrative. So much so that internationally, nations are asking our president, John F. Kennedy, what are we doing to protect the rights of Black people who are segregated in our nation when you're trying to fight a Cold War against the spread of communism throughout Eastern Europe? This is bad business for foreign policy. So Kennedy reaches out, dries the tears of Coretta, as Martin's father later said, and promised that he would send a delegation to Birmingham to make sure that Black grievances were addressed. Okay, now we have the attention of the federal government. Now we have the attention of the President of the United States. Now we might have some federal negotiation that, in good faith, delivers justice and equality in places where it didn't exist before. One of the things that happens, though, is that after the arrest, the media attention gets sort of bored. They start to leave. It's more demonstrations, more protests. What exactly is going on? There's no crisis. One of the things that occurs that really changes the civil rights trajectory of this nation was that it was determined by SCLC, and it still remains controversial today, that they would start Project C for confrontation. Force the issue. Use children. Children out of school, youthful enthusiasm, wanted to participate. And we're talking about children who aren't even high school age yet, because there's some tension between SCLC and groups like SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where SCLC is basically saying, hey, these college students are dangerous. Trust me, I know, I teach them. So they're unpredictable. Are they going to adhere to nonviolence? Maybe, maybe not. But kids, maybe their parents won't because they're afraid of losing a job. But children understand right from wrong. They want to participate. We need reinforcements again because the jails are being filled. So the children's campaign began in May of '63. And some of the pictures are pretty shocking even today. On day one of the children's campaign, 959 children were arrested. Bull Connor, in one sentence, lost his damn mind. Something broke. And I think it was the fact that he understood the momentum that they had, the segregationist side had, was over. The full authority of the police department and the fire department, trained canine units unleashed on the protesters, fire hoses that emit streams of 350 pounds per square inch of pressure, used against the elderly and children, giving people concussions, stripping bark from trees. The image that is one of the most indelible images of the movement, the German Shepherd biting the young man in the stomach. John Kennedy said when he saw that photograph, it made him physically ill. The city of Birmingham had to use school buses to take the children to jail. Pretty ironic. They ran out of police wagons, so they had to do something. These images, again, both forced and reflected the confrontation that Black people in the South have been living with for decades. These images were shocking to an international audience. They were shocking to an American audience. So, somewhere, we don't know exactly where, but Project C, Project Confrontation, kind of sets the blueprint, right? Nonviolence, provoke a response, outrage follows. The government is demanded that the government respond, legislation follows. Because what is promised, is that King's blueprint going into Birmingham? No, it's not. But he kind of figures it out along the way, right? So we get John F. Kennedy on June 11, 1963, go on television, calls civil rights the great moral crisis of our time. And John F. Kennedy was not someone who was always a champion of Black equality in America. Okay? But he promised to personally deliver a Civil Rights Act to Congress. One piece of legislation. Instead of fighting segregation on a city-by-city basis, almost like guerrilla warfare, now you could win the war with the stroke of a pen. That's what the movement pushed for. And this is why using democracy to address injustices is one of the most positive things about our system. King recognized that. And now the emphasis became the Civil Rights Act. We have to have this law if we are going to redeem the soul of America. The address, as I put it, I got ahead of myself a little bit, right? John F. Kennedy, that's actually the live television address on June 11, 1963. I don't like to do hero worship in history because people are flawed. People are complex. People make mistakes. But even the most flawed among us can do some really important things for human justice and equality when we have to. Medgar Evers is one of those people for me. Medgar Evers was the field secretary. He was the leading official of the NAACP in Mississippi. The tip of the segregated iceberg is what it's called. Medgar Evers was someone who lived with death threats daily. And on the night after John F. Kennedy promised the Civil Rights Act to the United States, Medgar Evers arrived home after an NAACP meeting and was gunned down in his own driveway as he crawled, dying, to his back porch. Had a hand of t-shirts in his arms that said, "Jim Crow must go." By the way, the person who assassinated him encountered 2 hung juries in 1964. He was not held accountable for his action until 1994, where he died in prison. He ran for lieutenant governor of Mississippi in 1967, and his campaign slogan was "Vote Taylor Beckwith, he's a straight shooter." This is the level of injustice and hate and shamelessness that existed in the South at that time. Medgar Evers. And the reason that I use this picture, there are many great photographs of Medgar Evers, right? He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He's a World War II veteran. He fought at Normandy. Okay? But it humanizes. This is a guy who had a family, a wife and 2 kids. And the world he was trying to make better was under his own roof, first and foremost. What does all of this have to do? We're 20 minutes in, and Dr. Butler hadn't mentioned St. Augustine yet. Build the St. Augustine. You don't just drop St. Augustine off at the very beginning, right? Because we are getting there. And we're not going backwards, we are going forwards. Dr. Robert B. Hailing. Speaking of people who are worthy of being called nothing short of hero. A name that's familiar. Go to the Accord Museum. Go to the Lincolnville Museum. Pick up Racial Change and community crisis, go to the Historical Society. You'll learn a lot about Robert B. Haley, a dentist, a Florida native. His father was a professor at Florida A&M, an Air Force veteran. As he told me, I had the pleasure of meeting him a couple of times. Quote, there was no need for me to bite my tongue about anything. I earned my citizenship in the Air Force. The thing I liked about Dr. Haley is he had absolutely no background in him. Dr. Haley was called too radical by some African Americans in St. Augustine. Definitely by most white people. He wanted too much too fast. Nah, he wanted the Constitution applied equally to all people. He became a member of the NAACP. He organized young people because of the youthful enthusiasm that he saw in this city. He became the advisor of the NAACP Youth Council. His dentist office is where the Accord Museum is, 40th Accord Museum is. We got fortunate enough for the students yesterday to visit. Between 40 and 60% of his clientele was white. So look, in a segregated society, just because laws separate people, customs bring us together. The reason you have to have segregated laws in the South is because there's so much interaction between white and blacks. So much so that literally on the edge of a segregated community, you have a dentist's office that attracts white and black people, including the likes of Hoss Manussi and L.O. Davis, the sheriff. As Dr. Haley said, I literally had my hands in their mouths. And he said that L.O. Davis had some of the most jacked up teeth he'd ever seen. I want that to be on his tombstone. But anyway, being the director of the Youth Council, I mean, look, one of the things that we see in the movement, and we see it locally, and you see it in Birmingham, is that adults have adult responsibilities. We have jobs, we have mortgages. You might have a relative that really needs their job. And if you're demonstrating, that relative could lose their job. The bank could recall your mortgage. Teenagers don't have that sense of responsibility. They are 10 foot tall and bulletproof. And they want to do something. Why? Because they're reading the papers about things that are happening in Greensboro, North Carolina. They're reading about the sit-in movement. They're reading about organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They're reading about King Thomas, who becomes a freedom rider from St. Augustine. They're reading about John Lewis and things that are happening in Montgomery and Nashville and Mississippi. And they want to bring change to St. Augustine, Florida. How do we do that? One of the big questions that we have is when and why does the FBI start to pay attention to things happening in St. Augustine? Because one of the most important primary sources historians have to document the local movement are FBI records. Okay? The FBI. Civil rights was escalating so rapidly and becoming, according to Bobby Kennedy, the nation's #1 domestic issue, that in May of 1963, the Attorney General's office began working with state attorneys to monitor the situation pertaining to segregation in cities across the South, including Florida. St. Augustine was mentioned for the first time that I found in May, late May of 1963, where it's like, yeah, things are segregated, restaurants are segregated, but it's all good. No agitation, as it's called. Okay? But when Medgar Evers was assassinated, this is where the FBI became really interested in the St. Augustine movement. Now look, no one person makes a movement. Movement makes people. And movement takes people like people in this room. It's not a top-down struggle, it's a bottom-up struggle. So I don't want you to leave saying Dr. Haley started the civil rights movement, but Dr. Haley was a catalyst for what's coming. That's really important. So, in response to the assassination of Medgar Evers, Dr. Haley was quoted by our local newspaper as saying, and I quote, on June 19, I and others have armed and we will shoot first and ask questions later. We are not going to die like Medgar Evers. St. Augustine Record doesn't do a great job of covering racial demonstrations in this city. We are going to shoot first and ask questions later. We're not going to die like Medgar Evers. In the FBI records, it says that Haling, and this goes back to DC, quote, Haling said, unless St. Augustine integrates immediately, we will come out shooting. What Dr. Haling actually said is that I will protect myself and my family with all available vigor and vitality. Always question the material that is attributed as a direct quote, particularly in times of social crisis. That was one of the most shocking things, and one of the things that I'll never forget about the meeting Dr. Haling. It was, wait a minute, you didn't say that? Because I knew that we're going to shoot first and ask questions later was the thing that I knew about Dr. Haling that got white supremacists to flood St. Augustine like the rains have the last few days. Okay? He didn't say it. Why? Because he was not a proponent of nonviolent defense, self-defense. Not everybody was. There's a minority of people involved in the movement who are dedicated philosophically or theologically to nonviolence. As an activist from Mississippi said, that nonviolent stuff will get you killed. There are divisions within the movement about how to best protect yourself against people who drive through Lincolnville in the middle of the night and shoot into homes that have lights on in the bathrooms. What do? That was Dr. Haling's approach. He was not nonviolent. Now, he wasn't violent, but there's a difference between self-defense and shooting first. The FBI files are almost daily, the record, daily after this. Now, all of a sudden, the federal government, the FBI, is paying attention to what's going on a daily basis. And it's the FBI files, which are to be taken with a grain of salt sometimes, by the way, that are beginning to monitor. St. Augustine is about to explode. And the reason it's about to explode is because of this activist Dennis. The activist Dennis persisted, organized boycotts, marches around the square, sit-ins. A couple of pictures of Dr. Haling here. I'm going to figure this out. Protests in the plaza, as I said, boycotts, marches. The arrest of 16 students, young people, on July 18, 1964, in what was the Woolworths cafeteria. Variety store. Sorry, I hate when people crunch stuff in my presence. So. 16 arrested. The local police made them a deal. If you say that Robert Haling put you up to it, we can get him for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Young people, juveniles, they didn't qualify, but people who were above 17 years old did, but they had to have everyone do it. There were 4 people held out. These heroes of the St. Augustine. Okay? This is the origin of the St. Augustine Four. 2 young women and 2 young men who said, yeah, the 2 young women, I know, okay, sorry. Oh, I'm going to blow y'all away in front of her. Yeah, the 4 young people, 2 male, 2 female, who said, no, we did this on our own accord. We'll suffer the consequences. And Dr. Haling, to his dying day, said that without them, quote, my goose would have been cooked. The local power structure wanted to shut down Robert Haling. And the activities, and you can see here, this is one of the sit-ins, the local sit-ins, here you recognize this in front of the slave market. With L.O. Davis, Virgil Stewart. He was the chief of police in St. Augustine, actually reading the signs. You know, an act of intimidation. Yeah, I'm an American too. My father died defending this country. Big picture. While St. Augustine is escalating in racial tension, because now I'll introduce you in a minute to some of the groups that are coming into St. Augustine to save the good and battered white people of the South because of all this civil rights mess, as they called it. Dr. King is keeping the pressure on the federal government because history demonstrates he was on the right side. The Kennedys are not to be trusted. The largest civil rights demonstration in American history then was planned, took place on August 28, 1963. It was the March on Washington movement for jobs and freedom. 5 largest civil rights organizations in America who never worked together before and didn't work together afterward, put together the largest support of civil rights legislation that this nation has ever seen. 250,000 people when they stopped trying to count. Would it work? Would it be a success? Would it fail? Nobody knew. This is an age way before social media. How can you bus people from California to Washington, D.C. for something this big? It happened. And the keynote, the last speaker, after Bob Dylan performed, actually, shout out rock and roll history class, was Dr. King because of Birmingham. It was Dr. King that got us here, quote unquote. He would give the keynote. And yes, we go into the I have a dream part of the speech, and that's where he goes into Baptist preacher mode. We know that part. People love, disingenuous people with bad intentions love to quote the content of my character, not the color of my skin, but they don't listen to the first part of that speech. If you really want to listen to things that are still relevant, listen to the first part of what becomes the I have a dream speech. He's talking about economic injustice. He's talking about the nation returning a check of promise that's returned to Black people marked insufficient funds. He's talking about police brutality. The significance is that it demonstrated to John F. Kennedy and his administration that, you know what? I'm going to lose the South. As a Democrat, South is all, man, it's a yellow dog Democrat place. If it's a yellow dog and a Democrat, it's going to win office. Okay? I might lose the South, but there's national support for this Civil Rights Act. Maybe it's not the political gamble he thought it was. For King, this is what had to be signed into law. St. Augustine, racial violence. It was a small miracle that people weren't murdered in this city, because murder, even of 4 little girls, 4 young women actually, who were changing from their Sunday school dresses into their choir robes on September 15, 1963, are murdered by Klansmen who had planted dynamite under the 16th Street Baptist Church. We now know, we knew who did it then. But the 16th Street Baptist Church was like the headquarters of the Birmingham movement, and it was targeted for that. People are dying. Young people. Murdered. All because they symbolized the racial promise that this country had yet to fulfill. It almost happened in St. Augustine. When we talk about white resistance in the ancient city, we've got local people. We've got local groups, the Ancient City Gun Club. We've got the National States Rights Party, J.B. Stoner from Georgia. We have Reverend Connie Lynch, the leader of a church called Jesus Christ Arian. We're talking about being ahead of your time. some of the quotes that the Three Stooges here actually come up with are quite repulsive even for 1964 standards, even for 1963 standards. So, cross burnings, convergences. St. Augustine was where they were going to make their stand for white supremacy, and they were going to do it by claiming as their headquarters the slave market, because that represented a way of life they wanted to preserve. Confederate flags, here it is not hate, whatever. A cross burning, advertised. September 18. Dr. Haling got a copy of the flyer and decided he would check it out. 4 people, Dr. Haling and 3 others, decided that they would go to the site where this cross burning was going to be held, because, as he hinted, he wanted to see who was there. Now, I have read different accounts of how this happened from other scholars. Were you kidnapped? You go there voluntarily. Was it at gunpoint? Did you make a wrong turn? That was another one. And when I asked him that question, he just smiled and said all of it. A road, a back road, so that they could view the cross burning, and there were about 350 people there. They were approached by Klansmen holding shotguns, and as Dr. Haling told me, again, this demonstrates the reality of the movement, and I had a .357 Magnum in my glove compartment. That nonviolent stuff will get you killed, especially when you pull up on Klan. They tried to back up. It had been raining. They got stuck kind of in a rut. All 4 men are taken at gunpoint to the Klan rally. An informant, a minister, Irv Cheney, a reverend, a Congregationalist minister from Daytona, was there, a white guy from Alabama. Shout out. That's where I'm at, LA, Lower Alabama. Right? Who was there as a plant, said, oh no, this is trouble, because Connie Lynch was speaking and said, well, look what we have here. The self-appointed king of the N-words. He called FBI headquarters in Jacksonville and said, we got to get help right now. Somebody is going to die. And they almost do. They're stripped to the waist. They're beaten. James Jackson always says, one of the young men who was there, that it was the women who were screaming, castrate them, do something. That stuck with him for the rest of, that has stuck with him for the rest of his life. The FBI made a call to the sheriff, and right as all 4 men are piled on top of each other, Dr. Haling said the last thing he heard was Connie Lynch say, how many of you have had the pleasure of smelling an N-word burn? That's the last thing he remembered. Sheriff L.O. Davis put an end to it. The speculation, and I think it's probably pretty certain, he was on site and got the call that the FBI knew what was about to happen. We don't know for sure, but circumstantial evidence and whatnot. It was a near lynching. Dr. Haling, NAACP youth leader. The NAACP did not endorse violent demonstrations. They didn't like mass demonstrations to begin with. The NAACP was very legalistic. We're going to fight segregation through the lawsuit, through lawsuits in the court system. Broken hands, teeth knocked out. For this, and I've read 2 accounts, I never asked him what really happened. I wish I would have. But did you resign from the NAACP or did they fire you? We know that the NAACP internally said, we've got to find a way to get this man out of the office gently because he's popular, but we cannot be affiliated with him. So does he see the writing on the wall and resign? Maybe. In March of 64, Hayling is literally a man without an organization. During February, there's a wave of violence because the Civil Rights Act is working its way through Congress. More on that in a minute. So he goes to SCLC. Dr. Hayling drives to Orlando, where the SCLC is having their annual convention, and basically says, we need help in St. Augustine, bad. SCLC decides reluctantly, and more on that in a minute, that St. Augustine is something that we need to get involved in. Now, this is where what happens locally begins to make national news. Right, big picture. Big picture. John Kennedy's assassinated, November 63. Lyndon Johnson becomes president, and in a stroke of political genius, says that we are going to propose the Civil Rights Act as the last testament to John F. Kennedy's memory. It was a piece of legislation he wanted. It passes the House in February. And while one of the most violent periods in St. Augustine history is occurring in Lincolnville nightly, including Dr. Hayling's house being shot into and his dog being killed, right? The House of Representatives passes the Civil Rights Act. Now it's going to the Senate. SCLC does decide that they will come to St. Augustine, but Dr. King is not sold. Hayling is not a minister. He's not nonviolent. He has support of young people, and for SCLC, like I said, that's dangerous. You don't know how young people are going to respond. And by the way, the city has been flooded by FBI agents who are sympathetic to the white supremacists who were there. Do we want to support this? Because if St. Augustine blows up, we could lose the Civil Rights Act. That's the motivation. The motivation is always the legislation. And if people are killed in St. Augustine and all of the elements are there for something really bad to happen, then all Southern politicians have to say is, oh, what's happening in St. Augustine? If we pass this, we are going to have race riots across the nation. Those are the stakes. So what SCLC decides to do is to send what was basically a temporary employee, Hosea Williams. Hosea Williams was hired, he was supposed to be on a temporary basis. Now, Hosea Williams had told people that the reason he joined the army was so that he could kill white people and get away with it. So there's cause for concern. However, he had had a religious awakening, but he still likes to drink, so he's a little volatile. It's all good. Who doesn't? Again, tailgating before a lecture. What's wrong with y'all? So Hosea Williams becomes the person who comes to St. Augustine to gauge the local situation. He's the one that speaks at mass meetings. He's the one that instructs local kids on nonviolent techniques and strategies. Like when you walk to the plaza, do not have something in your pocket that could be construed as a weapon because you will be arrested. Like when you walk to the plaza, men, teenagers, take the outside, have women and the elderly on the inside. So if you're attacked, you can shield them. There's a strategy here. There's a tactic here. And Hosea Williams is the person on the ground. And quite frankly, because it's one of his first jobs in SCLC, he embraces the community. Hosea Williams wants to use St. Augustine to send the nation a message. Dr. King is unconvinced. He's unconvinced. Too much could go wrong. The Easter campaign, though, forces SCLC to become more involved in what's going on pertaining to the national consequences. So you saw this in Birmingham, you see it in St. Augustine. There are some tactics that SCLC uses that's like the blueprint. And one of them is send an economic message over the Easter weekend or Christmas weekends or whatever the case. I had one SCLC leader tell me that people think they see black and white, but the only color that matters to them is green. So you boycott their stores, you don't shop during one of the busiest Black holiday shopping seasons of the year, and you send a message that until you hire Black people, until you treat us equally and with respect, we're not coming back to your store. That is the Easter campaign. Now, SCLC, when Dr. Halen met with them and they kind of did their recon of the area, and they're like, oh no, I don't know about this. What we can do though is put you in touch with SCLC affiliates in northern cities. You can use SCLC to bring in people from, oh, I don't know, Boston. Because there's a network of Episcopalians who were go-to when it came to coming to these cities and helping the movement. And in Boston, one of the people was an Episcopalian bishop named Malcolm Peabody. Accent. His son was the governor of Massachusetts, Endicott Peabody. The person who answered the phone when Hosea Williams called their office and said, we need help in St. Augustine, was the son of Malcolm. He wasn't in. But he took the message, and his mother, Mary Peabody, heard that St. Augustine was in the midst of a crisis, and she decided, I have raised my family to sacrifice, and I haven't set an example. I'm going to St. Augustine. This is Hosea Williams. And of course, he's holding up a paper that says Miss Peabody Jail. Spoiler alert. When Mary Peabody is arrested in St. Augustine in the Consummate Lodge on March 30th as part of the Easter campaign, what was a regional story with some national attention exploded. This went international. The mother of the governor of Massachusetts has been arrested for trying to dine in with her African-American best friend, Ann Robert Hay. I love that picture of Dr. Halen because he's like, I've had it. All y'all believe all. I'm sick of L.O. Davis reading. L.O. Davis told her she was breaking the law, and she said, read me the law. And he does, and you know. So, here you too, buddy. I've never seen someone so happy going to jail, 2 Americas. But anyway, so international news, literally. I have seen Italian newspapers with this story on the front page. Okay? What is SCLC going to do? The Civil Rights Act is now in the Senate. And the longest filibuster in U.S. history has started. King's dilemma is what to do in St. Augustine. Do we risk blowing up the Civil Rights Act? Or do we invest in people that we usually don't invest in? The press conferences on Dr. Halen's office porch. Dr. Halen, Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King, in the first press conference with the American flag in the background, very symbolic. Andrew Young later, Dr. Halen. By this time, Dr. Halen had moved his family to Cocoa Beach because the death threats and the violence in his home had been shot into so much, he had to get them out of town. The famous picture of the cottage where Dr. King, no one was supposed to know where Dr. King was staying. He was staying in a different place when he was in St. Augustine, and he was only in St. Augustine about 13, 14 days, right? He flew in and out of the city a lot. Nobody was supposed to know that he stayed there because to stay in the same home in consecutive nights meant you put that family in danger. But someone shot into the cottage. The FBI file said King loves attention, so it was probably SCLC that did that. When Dr. King spoke for the first time at First Baptist Church May 26th. He basically said that what was transpiring in St. Augustine was part of the magnificent drama that was transforming the nation. However, as Dorothy Cotton, SCLC field worker, said, quote, he knew that this was about the roughest city we've had, 45 straight nights of beating and intimidation. In church every night, we'd see people sitting there with bandages on. Some would sit with shotguns between their legs. We sang before we went out to get our courage up. The Klan was always waiting for us. These folks with the chains and bricks and things. 45 straight nights. King knew we need to de-escalate. So I'm leaving Andy Young behind to de-escalate. Andrew Young was conciliatory. He was a negotiator. He's a politician, right? He and Hosea Williams did not get along. Hosea Williams was very ready, fire, aim. And Andrew Young is more, no, let's talk this out. Let's reason through it. Let's reach compromise. Let's have consensus. May 27, May 28, Andy Young was left in St. Augustine to supervise SCLC activities. As he said, quote, it wasn't a fight we wanted. But as he got to know the people here, and as he experienced, for the only time in his life, being attacked and beaten unconscious, his activities, all of a sudden, he changed his mind. June 9th is when, at Andrew Young Crossing, Andrew Young is attacked. Hit with a blackjack twice, right? He gets up the first time, the second time, he's blindsided and knocked unconscious. We've seen the video footage because the Florida State Highway Patrol was there recording it, not to protect the demonstrators, but so that they could train their police in crowd control techniques. It's public record. 4 days earlier, on June 5th, federal negotiators sent by the Attorney General said that St. Augustine is, quote, 5 days before Andrew Young is attacked, that St. Augustine was too dangerous for federal intervention. The federal government said no thanks. June 5th. We don't need to get involved in this. Now, Dr. King's two main lieutenants, Hosea Williams and Andrew Young, say St. Augustine is where we have to make our stand. This is the place. Hey, look, we forget this in St. Augustine, but there are a lot of places, there's a lot of strategizing where King and SCLC leaders are saying, do we go to Danville? Do we go back to Birmingham? Do we go to Mississippi? No, we're not going to Mississippi. Do we go to St. Augustine? They didn't know exactly where they wanted to be as the Civil Rights Act was making its way through Congress. But after June 9, St. Augustine becomes the place. Not only that, but the protests expand to the beaches. The swim-ins, this has a tremendous impact nationally. Because the idea of how do you segregate the ocean, my German contingent smiling like, what? Yeah. Americans, man. And you have riots that break out. You have chains and tire irons. You have a Danish journalist who has a camera pushed in his face by a baseball bat. The ludicrousness of bringing police dogs into the water to keep white and black people separate. The thing that's changed, though, is that the Florida Highway Patrol was sent to protect the demonstrators. This is one of the first times that had happened in St. Augustine, where you have law enforcement who were sent from the state level to protect local people. That's a change. Things are beginning to turn. We are in about day, I don't know, I would say 56 of the filibuster that's going on in the Senate at this time. This is when the showdown at the Monson Motor Lodge occurs. Right? We're building to this. We're building to one of the most famous photographs in American civil rights history. Right? The Monson Motor Lodge. The Monson Motor Lodge, where the Hilton is on the bayfront, most of y'all know that. Jimmy Brock always felt that he was personally targeted. He wasn't. The media stayed there. It was one of the newest hotels, but more importantly, the owner of the Monson Motor Lodge was the president of the Florida Hotel Owners Association. It was what it symbolized. And you can see that he's not sympathetic to the requests pertaining to integration. A fake latent term that says, don't let the bastards grind you down. He was defiant. He was defiant. Dr. King is arrested here because it was determined that if we are going to capture international attention and get support for the act, I have to be arrested again. Letter from Birmingham jail, just a year earlier. Okay, June 11, it happened, trying to enter the Monson Motor Lodge, the only city in Florida where Dr. King was ever incarcerated. That always is left out of the Chamber of Commerce publications. I don't know why. But from St. Johns County Jail, Dr. King's there. We've got his fingerprints card. Ask around, you'll know where to go. June 18 was the final kind of showdown. The filibuster, and a filibuster, obviously, for those of you who don't know, a filibuster is when you try to stop a bill from being passed by literally talking it to death. You're taking up all the time so a vote can't be held. Okay? I think about this time you have Robert Byrd, who's going to speak for 14 hours straight. We're about to get the ball across the goal line. We need something nationally, push support for it, and maybe convince people who are on the fence about whether or not this law should even be passed. On the 18th, it was determined that there would be a large contingent that went to the Monson Motor Lodge and prayed. And that contingent was made up of Jewish rabbis, led by Jewish rabbis. Because when Dr. King was in jail in St. Johns County, he wrote Israel Dresner, who had helped out in Albany, and said, "Si, I need your help. Come to St. Augustine and bring as many rabbis as you can." He did. He brought 16 people, 15 rabbis and one rabbinical student. And as they knelt to pray, and look, white people, particularly religious leaders who were sympathetic to the civil rights movement, were often treated worse than some of the local African Americans because, as the leader of the Ancient City Gun Club said, the only thing worse than an N-word is an N-word lover. And these Jewish N-words, as they were called, were seen as worse than any white person. So when they knelt to pray, Brock began to grab them, and this was in the New York Times the next day, and forced their arrest. It remains to this day the largest mass arrest of Jewish rabbis in American history. But it was a diversionary tactic, because at the same time, a white member of the SCLC had checked into the hotel, Al Lingo, and he invited his guests to join him. So as Jimmy Brock is having these rabbis arrested and black ministers, because another person who was in that parking lot was Fred Shuttlesworth from Birmingham. Convergence. Lingo gave the sign, and a group of African Americans jumped the chain and entered the pool. SCLC members, as this happened, photographers had been notified, going down at Monster Motor Lodge, you might want to be there. But they had no idea that this photograph would be taken. The image of James Brock pouring muriatic acid into the pool. JT Johnson was a lifeguard, and he was at the other end of the pool, and he was basically saying, it won't hurt you, it won't hurt you. They don't know that, right? So the image is literally on the front page of the Washington newspaper the next day when the vote for the Civil Rights Act was held. Filibuster was over. It had ended the previous day. One of the most surreal moments was hearing George McGovern and Andrew Young. I actually was in the room with them when they were having this conversation about, this is what we were doing in St. Augustine, and this was the intended effect. Were you guys talking about it? And McGovern's like, yeah, yes, we were talking about that picture. When I gave this presentation in Orlando, a gentleman who was there about my age said, in our history textbooks in Italy, this picture's in books. They had no idea it was in Florida. But when they talk about civil rights in America, this was one of the pictures. He had seen it before. He just didn't have the context, right? So, after 60 working days, after 83 days of debate, after 534 hours of filibustering, it filled 63,000 pages in the congressional record. It's an estimated 10 million words. The filibuster was over and the Civil Rights Act passed. That day, James Brock and his daughter raised a Confederate flag to show that while by law they had to comply in spirit, they didn't. I do another lecture on the letter from St. Augustine jail that the rabbis wrote, and it's tremendous. They actually explain, the name of the letter is Why We Win. And they tie their own persecution years earlier, they tie the Holocaust to the civil rights movement in St. Augustine. Fun primary source, again, just to show convergence and how national this movement is. We have been witnessing with great concern the vicious attacks of the white races against our poor defenseless people in St. Augustine. If the federal government doesn't send troops, just give us the word and we'll dispatch our brothers to organize self-defense and give the Ku Klux Klan a taste of its own medicine. The day of turning the other cheek to those brute beasts is over. Yours truly, Malcolm X. Not yours truly, I think it would have been better to say hugs and kisses, Malcolm X, right? But at this time, oh, if you want to use this, and I do, in my classes to say, by this time, Malcolm X has left the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X is wanting to become a more active participant in the American Civil Rights Movement, you would do no better than this document. July 2nd, 1964, the Civil Rights Act is signed into law. The most comprehensive, far-reaching piece of civil rights legislation this country has ever produced. The democratic system worked for a change. It prohibited discrimination in public accommodations and employment, created the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. It threatened to revoke federal funds from businesses that continued to integrate. It provided enforcement mechanisms to ensure that segregation was dead. It even had enough elements to provide the foundation for the Voting Rights Act in the very next year, 1965. If you were an American citizen, the Civil Rights Act is relevant to your life today. The Civil Rights Act remains the foundation for all civil rights legislation that continues to occur in this nation. And it's one reason why it's under so much attack. If you don't think it's important, look at the efforts to try to undercut it. Same thing with the Voting Rights Act. If it's not powerful, why are so many people who claim to love liberty trying to undermine liberty? Dr. King was in St. Augustine when he learned that the Civil Rights Act passed. Victory. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, in large part because of what happened in St. Augustine. Yet, at the end of his life, when he talked about all he had seen, he loved to tell a story about the little girl who said, "I'm so glad you didn't sneeze," when he was stabbed by a deranged woman and the knife missed his heart by a millimeter. The doctor told him if you sneezed, you would have died. And she said, "I'm so glad you didn't sneeze." And he said, because if I had sneezed, I would not have seen. And he goes on the civil rights greatest hits list, right? I would not have been in Albany, Georgia. I would not have been in Washington, D.C. I would not have faced the dogs of Birmingham. He never mentioned St. Augustine. And when I asked Andrew Young, why was St. Augustine never mentioned, it's because he said, and I quote, because we wanted to forget about it. SCLC looked at St. Augustine as a defeat because it was the only city that the laws changed the circumstances and not local conciliation. They were promised a biracial committee. One of the things that SCLC always wanted was for Black and white people to work together on a committee to solve their grievances. Every white person who was put on it so that SCLC could leave resigned before the first meeting. That organization has yet to meet. In fact, Dr. King often claimed that some cities had to bear the cross for all others. And St. Augustine was one of those places. St. Augustine had to bear the cross. There was no local compromise, no local resolution. The Klan targeted here businesses that integrate. We think that after civil rights legislation passed, everything gets better. Not necessarily. 65 and 66, I've been told by some people, was just as violent in many respects as 63 and 64. Lincolnville paid a price for the Civil Rights Act. They bear the cross of integration. Residents had to go back to living together. It's a small town. People that you thought were loving neighbors turned out to be white supremacists who wanted you to stay in your so-called place. How do you go back to living with people like that again? How do you go back to looking at L.O. Davis like someone who can give you equal justice if you're a person of color? You can't. The movement and its legacy is complex. And the reason that I say that is because on July 4th, our nation's holiday, 1964, 2 days after the Civil Rights Act passed, these people converged on the plaza. We're not going to comply. It's the message. What happens at the local level, then, can have national consequences that may benefit others to the detriment of the people who sacrifice the most. What it does is demonstrate that the movement is not necessarily a movement of linear progression for all people at all times, but that the cost of racial progress does in fact have a price. St. Augustine was the only SCLC campaign where medical expenses exceeded legal costs. Not Selma. Willie Bolden told me Bloody Sunday was one time. St. Augustine was every night. Not Birmingham. St. Augustine, the only city that SCLC organized where medical costs exceeded legal expenses. But some cities, some communities pay the price so that others can experience equalities that may have yet to come to communities like ours. That's why it's relevant. Local history reflects national and influences national change. And as long as we continue to tell these stories and stress its relevance, despite how uncomfortable the stories make you, it reflects the American reality, our collective American experience. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. Oh, before we do that, I think what we can do, and I know we've gone a little long. Y'all were great. So you paid attention for the most part, and you know, you fell asleep. That's okay. I bored you too. Period of questions, because I know that for everything that I covered, and remember, the purpose is to put it in context and to tell the St. Augustine story in a national context. But I wanted to take some questions, right? Because a lot is left out. Yes, ma'am.
I hope sometime it can be over, but what should we do about this new law that you try to pass and say you have to have your birth certificate or something to prove you're from the United States?
I'll get out of here. What I will say, the question was voting restrictions. Voting restrictions. What I will say about voting restrictions is that historically it remains a civil rights issue. And you have to have people who both question the system but also defend it. Because the right to vote in a democratic society is the most important thing to keep it functioning smoothly, or to keep it functioning, shall we say. So vigilance and education are imperative. And when I say education, I don't just mean from one outlet. Do your research, because what we learn is that sometimes what we read is actually not the true information. So what I would say there is know the laws, do the research, and act on it politically. That's the only way. That's the only way that these issues, again, in a democratic society where we don't agree on everything, that they can be compromised and worked through the legal process fairly and equitably. That's all I got to say about that.
A couple of footnotes, if I may.
Yes, sir.
David Rustin, protege of A. Randolph, almost when he was preparing the 63 March, said to me, King recognized the importance of national attention in the press after Birmingham. Footnote 1.
Right.
Footnote 2. When after the Voting Rights Act, a number of us did some voter registration work in Virginia, not the South. It was the FBI who called to tell us when the time was over. Interesting. Footnote 3, when the rabbis wrote their note, we had a 50th anniversary meeting. They didn't make so much the direct connection with the atrocities of the Holocaust, although it was available. They said, how could we stand by the blood of our brothers when our complaint was that the world stood by at the death of 6 million?
The comment was on the correlation that the rabbis made in the letter with the Holocaust. The FBI, not always the bad guys, because the thing about the FBI is that often, particularly in the South, agents from a specific region would be sent to the state so that where they were from, so they could blend in. So if you're a Virginian, you're going to be sent as an agent to Virginia because you literally speak the language. If you are from South Alabama, you might be sent to St. Augustine because you understand the way things are. So yes, I think that the experience with the FBI can differ during this period depending on time and place. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm currently reading Math for the Senate. And
Yes.
so in your
Proper
scale of heroism, where do you put Lyndon Johnson?
He is up there until Vietnam.
Oh, yeah.
Lyndon Johnson, what I will say in terms of scale, he is an enigma because when people ask about presidents, I say, okay, are we talking about foreign policy or domestic policy? Because you can't say one person is a good president if they don't. Okay, so I tend to split them. And when it comes to domestic policy, make no mistake about it. Great society trumps the New Deal, period. And that was what LBJ wanted to do. But guess what? The money that was intended to fund the Great Society was spent in the jungles of Vietnam fighting a war that we knew we could not win. So that is his Achilles heel. That is his legacy. He's an enigma because domestically and socially progressively, we wanted to put all of this money into social reform, Head Start, Medicare, Medicaid, HUD, the transportation system. But at the same time, we're mired in a quagmire that he knew we would never get out of victorious. So it's that conundrum. And oh, by the way, where LBJ does get a lot of negative marks in my historical record book is that when King comes out against the Vietnam War, LBJ shuts him off and sits J. Edgar Hoover on him. That's where LBJ, to me, becomes villainous in his behavior. I gave you people all of this and you criticized me for that. Get them, Hoover, and they did. Mr. Jackson.
I know there was a sucking sound at the SCLC, but I wanted to see, did you do any research or do you have any information about the role that young people at the more college play?
Absolutely. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That was one of the things. Okay, we went long enough, right? I was kind of like a kid with a Christmas list when I was working out this lecture because it's like, it's too long. I'm not going to get everything in. People will start leaving. So one of the things that I cut out because nationally it didn't have the same resonance was the role that our students, local students from not just Florida Memorial, but also Murray High School played, right? The Murray High School students in Florida Memorial, oh boy, Florida Memorial, that is interesting because the president at the time, Royal Courier, was trying to keep his students from participating and they did not listen. So they got involved. Murray High School staged the walkout so that they could walk to what is now the Keenan Hall parking lot on Flagler College property to integrate the Ponce de Leon Hotel. And one of the people who was arrested for trying to integrate actually became one of the first Black graduates of Flagler College after it became a college. So, yes, local people, both in high school and Florida Memorial, sacrificed and participated, and Florida Memorial paid a price because the trustees there are convinced that one of the reasons they had to leave St. Augustine was because of the difficulties that they encountered due to the fact that they didn't do more in 63 and 64 to stop the movement. They felt that they were forced out. Some communities have to bear the cross for others. Some colleges, like Florida Memorial, did. Good question. Any other questions? Okay.
Well, something that was most significant.
Man. Most significant thing talking with Dr. Haley. How much it still meant to him to have suffered as he did. That man, when talking about what happened in 64, acted like it happened last week. And it's people like that and stories like that that motivate me in what I do, quite frankly. If I have this knowledge and have the opportunity to talk to the Andrew Youngs and the Robert Halings of the world, and I don't share their stories, that's professional malpractice on my part. Particularly when I have a platform, I have an accent, and I have a skin tone that demonstrates the importance of these stories to all Americans equally. So for Dr. Haling to see to hear him say, I lost everything. I lost my business. I had to leave St. Augustine and I never wanted to come back. You understand why? So for me, that personal hurt that he still had with him, and how much it meant to him that St. Augustine was finally beginning to recognize, finally, that he was trying to uplift the whole community, not just one group. That did mean a lot to him, I thought. You know, he was very overly thankful that we hosted him, and it's like, this is my pleasure. So yeah, that to me is something I'll never forget. And also just his bluntness and his earnestness. I love that. I love like I said, he had no back down. And I appreciate it. Game recognized.
So my question is, you talked about how Dr. King, kind of like turned away from St. Augustine.
Yeah.
Why do you think the city of St. Augustine and locals here in St. Augustine didn't talk about what happened, or that there was such a willingness to let that story kind of hang and die for so long before?
Because that's a loaded question. That's a loaded question. This Phil's trying to get me fired. I think you're trying to get me hired at Lincolnville. Who's down there? Yeah. Why did many residents in St. Augustine not want to talk about this story? Because they thought, number one, that St. Augustine was unfairly maligned, targeted, made to look bad. The other thing is because some of their relatives were on the wrong side of history.
So, even the picture that's behind you,
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, most pictures of the Klan, you see them with hoods on.
Now I know where you're going with this. I need to change it.
So, I mean, has there been any effort to identify who these people are?
Carrying a bill. Has there been, not for this picture, I don't know, but there have been, I mean, we have identified like the person who attacked Andrew Young. We know that now. We know who it was.
There's a boldness that.
It is a boldness because you don't have to hide. You are the majority. You run the city. What do you have to hide from? When I mentioned the leader of the Ancient City Gun Club, Halstead Halsmanusi, the first time I talked about it in Flagler College Civil Rights class, someone said, yeah, that is my great uncle. So I learned real fast that people have connections. I had someone when I came to Flagler, and it was, you know, it was to do Florida civil rights. Okay, St. Augustine particularly. Okay, cool. Someone reached out to me to take me out to lunch to say, yeah, we see that you're hired and you do this. But I want you to know from someone who's lived here their entire life that it wasn't as bad as the textbook said. That was my introduction to St. Augustine. Seriously. Sometimes we're tone deaf because we don't want to listen to people's stories. Right? So I think was there, I think, a hesitation for the city to embrace its history? Because quite frankly, they were embarrassed and ashamed. And they know that they were on the segregationist side, not the side for equality and justice. That's
You just noticed there are ladies in that picture.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if the Klan here accepted women, but usually in Klan organizations, there's a women's auxiliary unit and there's even children's units. Seriously. Some of them, this is so clownish, but they call them the KKK, the Ku Klux Kiddies, KIDDIES. So you'll have little pictures of little kids in Klan uniforms, like racist Boy Scouts or something. Yeah.
And this gets Gail brought it up. St. Thomas County's Historic Preservation Officer. And I was also a county historian. And the county that was shot up that, associated with, the owner offered to donate that structure to the county, and I began that conversation. And I was forced to resign my position, allowing Black people to publicly. At the same time, I was asked to investigate the attempted lynching of Dr. Haven on the Gennevar property because the county was afraid that it occurred on the property that they were about to purchase for $17.5 million. I was told that the county was concerned that if the history of the property and Robert B. Halen and the connection with the Gennevar property and the Canwright House, because the county believed that members of the clan who had kidnapped Halen had attacked the Canwright House, that it would disrupt the county's business dealings. And I was forced to resign for my public interaction with the Black community. The house ended up being saved thanks to the efforts of Mr. Jackson here and the coalition, which I was asked to deny access to my office to and violate public accommodations of the Civil Rights Act because of the politics of it. So it begs the question, how much progress have we made? And
At the local level, the state level, or both?
local, but especially at the local level. I think 2 years ago. So this was 2 years ago. And so when there's support for the Black community and preserving its history, I do wonder how serious they are, or if they're just playing politics and they're really indifferent. Because after I was forced to resign, the county dissolved the Historic Resource Management Office to make sure it never happens again. To make sure that histories like what happened here in the county 16 years ago never told again. There was concern about the CRB wanting a memorial built on the property to Dr. Halen, which the county didn't want, because the county was concerned about stirring up angry sentiments from the clan and people who were related. I was asked if I was doing research, if I was going to run massive. And I wasn't. That wasn't something I was looking into. But still, as a public servant, I was retaliated against. And I think the community has suffered from that. This was only 2 years ago.
And people say history doesn't matter. It reminds me of the William Faulkner quote, "Past is not dead, it's not even past." The relevance here, sorry, I think the answer to your question about how political is it, forced resignation, those two words together kind of gives you your answer. Why do we tell the stories we do, and whose stories do we intentionally leave out? That's a question that all scholars, all historians working in the public realm have to ask, and that leads to some uncomfortable conversations, but necessary. Some people had to bear the cross so that other stories could be told, and I'm sorry you were the people that had to. Yes, sir.
What do you think of status of the pioneers today in technology?
The staff of the clan in St. Augustine today. Same mentality, different costumes. I'll just leave it at that. You don't need a clan when you have Proud Boys. But you've got Confederate flags. Oh, you got plenty of those. Same mindset, different costume.
Now you have to.
I'm representing Florida Humanities, and I was told that political commentary is more divisive than it is instructive. And free state of Florida, baby. The mindset's not dead. The idea that one group is inherently better than another, and that the other group can never rise to the level is called white supremacy. We're uncomfortable with that term, but it's real. If you believe because of your racial characteristics that you are inherently more superior, more advanced, smarter, whatever the case may be, more industrious than another group simply because of their race, you in fact have subscribed to the concept of white supremacy. And that concept still exists.
So what are they afraid of? That the other group will gain ground?
I think fear, anger, hate. The fear is I'm going to lose something because you're going to get it at my expense. It's a simplistic way to understand complex issues. Demagoguery says whatever your problem is, it's not your fault, it's them, whoever them is. Right, German students?
I think you're better than somebody else.
You think you're better because of characteristics that you had no personal control over. Just because you're born this means that you're not that, and they can never be you, and you will never be as low as them. White supremacy is a hell of a drug. But it is a reality that is both historical and contemporary.
So one of the things that, in the plaza, in the KKK was talking, the speeches that are, was, not one end will get a job until every white person has a job. And so they were like, they listened to Dr. King's speech, so they knew about the education and employment. So that's was a part of their fear that they used to rally, the people around them that they needed.
Fear is a good one. The other thing is that I'll point out is that we claim to love history. History, we love history. We want to keep our history alive. We love nostalgia. A manufactured, imagined past that never existed because it makes you feel good about who you are today. That's not history. History's messy, complex, dirty, instructive, and painful. History should make you uncomfortable because it's an uncomfortable topic. What we have done to others in the name of country, God, and family sometimes is not pleasant. You say maybe we need to learn from it, maybe. Maybe we need to use it to be more informed, empathetic, productive members of a democratic society when we go to the polls. Absolutely. But yeah, these concepts and the idea of this history, but not that history, whose stories are told, is this nostalgia? Did it really happen like that? All this is important because it makes us think about who we think we are today. Sometimes we fall for it. And if you do something about it. I'm sharing this with my employer. Thank y'all so much for coming out. My next one is better. So oh yeah. Thank you.
Oh, I don't know what the airdrop was. So, sorry, I am not a phone person, so.